Burlington, Iowa, has always been a place where everyone knows everyone else, especially in the Oak Street neighborhood, where the Dawson family's small white house stood, with its neatly mowed lawn and red geraniums on the front porch. Betty Dawson was getting ready for her morning shift at the local clinic where she had worked as a nurse for 15 years. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, and the sound of water came from the second floor as their adopted daughter Lauren showered before school. Garth, Betty's husband, was asleep after an overnight flight. He returned in the morning, dropping his silver Ford off in the garage, and went straight up to the bedroom. Working as a trucker didn't leave much time for his family, but it paid well, and jobs were scarce in their town. "Lauren, breakfast is ready," Betty shouted, laying out scrambled eggs and bacon on plates. Her 17-year-old daughter came down to the kitchen, wrapped in a towel, her dark hair wet. "Mom, I'm late for choir practice. Can I just have coffee?" Betty sighed. Lauren had always been thin, but lately she'd started eating very little. "At least have some toast," she insisted, and her daughter reluctantly agreed. While Lauren dressed, Betty packed her husband a lunchbox for the road. He had another flight to Chicago tomorrow morning. Their life flowed in the same rut: work, school, home, the occasional family dinner when Garth was home. They'd adopted Lauren 5 years ago. The quiet 12-year-old girl from an orphanage in Des Moines had gradually become a real daughter. Betty remembered Garth teaching her to ride her bike, painting her room lavender together, celebrating her first A's at her new school. Marge Simpson, their neighbor and former English teacher, often said the Dawsons were a model family. "I wish everyone would treat foster children that way," she'd say, as she treated Betty to homemade pie. But in recent weeks, something subtly changed. Lauren had begun spending more time in the garage with Garth, ostensibly interested in the mechanics of cars. She'd never shown any interest in mechanics before. Betty noticed other little things, too. The odd looks between husband and daughter. The way Lauren primps herself before Garth returns from a flight. The way they both fall silent when Betty enters the room. "You're getting paranoid," she told herself as she arranged the medications in the clinic closet. "It's ridiculous to suspect such a thing." That September evening, when Garth announced the extra flights to Chicago, Lauren twitched strangely and dropped her fork. Then she'd gone quickly to her room, citing a headache. Betty lay awake for a long time, listening for footsteps in the house. She thought she heard the door to the garage creak open, but she didn't get up to check. Sometimes it was better not to know the truth. At least that's what she'd thought back then, in the very early fall, when their lives still seemed normal. October in Burlington had been unusually cold. The maples on Oak Street turned purple, carpeting the sidewalks with a rustling carpet. Betty loved this time of year. The cool mornings, the hot coffee and pumpkin pies Marge generously shared with the neighbors. But this year, fall brought with it anxiety. Betty couldn't say exactly when she'd begun to notice changes in Lauren's behavior. Maybe when her daughter first refused her favorite blueberry pancakes at breakfast? Or when she started locking the bathroom door even though she'd never done it before? "She's just growing up," Betty reassured herself as she folded another soiled pillowcase into the laundry basket. Lauren was now often nauseous in the mornings. "Must have eaten something," her daughter explained, hurriedly stuffing an unfinished sandwich into her backpack. Garth was taking more and more extra flights. "Gotta save up for college for Lauren," he'd say as he packed his bag for the trip. But when he got back, he spent most of his time in the garage. Lauren was there, ostensibly to help fix up the old Ford. One day, Betty came in out of the blue looking for a hammer. Garth stood too close to Lauren, leaning over the open hood. They recoiled from each other as if burned. "Showing you how to check the oil level," Garth said hoarsely. At the clinic, Betty was increasingly distracted from her work. Her co-workers noticed her absent-mindedness. "Are you okay?" Judy, the head nurse, asked. "Yeah, just tired," Betty answered habitually. Marge sensed something too. "Lauren's lost weight," she remarked over a cup of tea one day. "And her eyes are a bit droopy. Maybe she's in love?" Betty remained silent. She didn't feel like discussing her daughter with her neighbor. In November, Lauren began wearing baggy sweaters, though she'd been a fan of tight tops. Cold, She shrugged in response to her mother's questioning look, but Betty could see her daughter furtively examining herself in the mirror, turning sideways. Garth had become irritable. He snapped at little things, sat on his cell phone for long periods of time. One day, Betty accidentally saw a message on the screen. "Miss you, waiting." The sender was labeled simply with an L. Silence now reigned at dinner. Lauren was picking at her plate, Garth was staring at the newspaper, and Betty was trying to make conversation about school, the weather, anything to avoid the oppressive silence. "Why don't we go to the movies this weekend?" she suggested one day. "Sorry, Mom, I have a chemistry project," Lauren replied quickly. "And I'm taking an extra flight," Garth added without looking up. At night, Betty lay awake for long stretches of time. She listened for rustles in the house, for footsteps on the stairs. Sometimes she thought she heard muffled voices in the garage, but when she looked out the window, it was dark and quiet. From time to time, she caught odd glances between her husband and daughter. Some special tension, as if an electric current passed between them. They were careful not to be alone in her presence, but Betty sensed something was going on when she wasn't home. During the last week of November, Lauren began missing school. "My stomach hurts," she complained. But when Betty offered to take her to the doctor, her daughter flatly refused. That evening, Betty found a crumpled pharmacy receipt in the trash. Antiemetic pills. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time, clutching that little piece of paper in her hands. A cold, paralyzing anxiety grew inside. "Lord, let it not be what I think it is," she whispered, looking at her gaunt face in the mirror. But a mother's heart already knew the truth. All it took was the courage to look her in the eye. It was a snowy December. Burlington was covered with snowdrifts, and the janitors cleared the paths from morning till night. Betty especially loved this time of year. The Christmas lights strung all over the city, the smell of cinnamon and pine needles, the pre-holiday rush. But this year was different. On Christmas Eve, she was on duty in the emergency room when the head of the department approached her. "You had your daughter in the women's clinic with Dr. Riley today," she said softly. Betty went white. In a small town, news travels fast. That evening, when Garth was back on his flight, she knocked on her daughter's room. Lauren sat on the bed with her arms around her knees, staring out the window at the falling snow. An unopened history book lay on the table, a mountain of unworn clothes cluttered in the corner. "We need to talk." Betty crouched on the edge of the bed. Lauren didn't move. "I know you've been to the doctor." Silence. "Are you pregnant?" A nod. "Who's the father?" Lauren burst into tears, burying her face in her knees. "I can't tell you," she sobbed. "Please don't ask." The next few days passed like a blur. Betty took time off work, calling in sick, made broths for Lauren, who was still very nauseous, did all her laundry, tried to get her to talk. Garth returned on December 23rd. Betty told him the news in the kitchen while Lauren was upstairs. She expected an explosion, a scandal, but her husband reacted strangely calm. "We'll support her," he said. "She's still a child. We need to be there for her." On Christmas Eve, for the first time in years, they didn't go to the neighbors for a traditional dinner. Marge brought them turkey and pie and shook her head, looking at a gaunt Lauren. "What's wrong with our girl?" she asked Betty. "Flu," she lied. January brought frost and new worries. Lauren had almost stopped going to school. Distance learning, she explained to her teachers. All day long she sat in her room or in the garage with Garth. Betty noticed her husband was home more often, took fewer long-distance flights. "Taking care of my daughter," he'd say. But something in his voice, in his gaze, made Betty's heart clench with fear. One day she caught them in the garage. Lauren was crying, and Garth was holding her by the shoulders, saying something quietly. They hadn't noticed Betty. She saw how gently her husband stroked his daughter's hair, how he held her close, too tenderly, too close. Strange habits had developed in the house. Lauren and Garth always made sure to sit next to each other at the table. She'd make him a thermos of coffee for the road. Betty had been the only one to do that before. He bought her special herbal teas for nausea and vitamins. The drugstore recommended it. Betty started finding little things. Lauren's accidentally dropped hairbrush in Garth's bedroom, his sweater in her room. I got cold, Daddy let me warm it up, her daughter explained, but the sweater smelled like her perfume. At night, Betty could hear the stairs creaking, the slamming of the garage door, quiet conversations in the kitchen when everyone should be asleep. She'd find long, dark hair on the floor, the same as Lauren's. In mid-January, she ventured to talk to her daughter one more time. Lauren was sitting in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring her cooled tea. She was wearing Garth's very same sweater. "Honey," Betty began, "I have to know. Is it someone from school? Did anyone hurt you?" Lauren shook her head. "Mom, please." Her voice trembled. "I can't. Don't make me. But the baby's father knows?" A strange smile touched Lauren's lips. "Yes, he knows. He cares about us." Betty stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time that evening, scrutinizing her aged face. When had she had time to change so much? When had her perfect family begun to crumble? The door slammed loudly downstairs. Garth had returned from the garage. "Honey, where are you?" he shouted, and Betty heard Lauren come downstairs toward him. Too fast, too joyful. She turned the water on full blast so she couldn't hear their voices. But even through the noise of the water, she could distinguish her daughter's quiet laughter and her husband's low voice. And that was more frightening than any scream. February was freezing cold. The melted snow had turned the streets of Burlington into mush, and the constant drizzle had forced the townspeople to hide in their homes. Betty now often sat at the living room window, watching the house across the street where Marge lived. The old teacher liked to sit in a chair by the window too, and they often met glances across the street. 8 months pregnant, Lauren was already struggling to get around the house. She had dropped out of school for good, after the principal had talked to Betty. She had been homeschooled, though it was clear that the school year was already lost. One morning, picking up the dirty laundry, Betty found Lauren's cell phone under her pillow. The screen flashed, showing an unread message. "Love you, baby girl. Be back soon." The sender was listed as G. Betty went cold. She found dozens of pictures in the gallery, Garth and Lauren in the garage, in his car, in the backyard. Each snapshot was like a knife to the heart. By March, Lauren's belly had gotten so big she could barely wrap her arms around it. She hardly ever left the house, spending most of her time in the garage with Garth. He'd set up a sort of recreation room in there, an old couch, a heater, even a small refrigerator. Marge made frequent visits. "It's only a matter of time before the birth," she shook her head. "And then what? Who's going to help with the baby? Where's the father?" But Lauren would only say nothing, and Garth would invariably say, "We'll manage." Garth had almost stopped taking long-haul flights. "The company cut back on routes," he explained. But Betty watched him take Lauren away in his pickup truck. Not for long now. In her position, long trips were tiring. They came back quiet, but with some secret joy in their eyes. The baby's room was gradually filling up with things: a crib, a changing table, mountains of diapers and swaddles. "A friend gave it away," Lauren said. Betty silently eyed the price tags from the expensive store. It was the kind of spending Garth had never dared to do before. At the clinic, she started picking up extra shifts in the lab. "I want to learn new techniques," she explained to the supervisor. In fact, she studied the procedure of DNA testing, even conducted a pilot test on random samples. By the end of March, the decision had matured. Betty ordered an official DNA test kit online. "We'll ship in 2 weeks," the manager informed her. She nodded, figuring she'd be just in time for the baby's arrival. That evening, she looked through old family albums. Here was Lauren just arriving at their house, a skinny 12-year-old girl with frightened eyes. Here, she and Garth fixing her first bicycle. Here's the family picnic. When did it all go wrong? At what point did she miss that turn? Betty pulled out a bottle of whiskey and poured herself 2 fingers. Lauren's voice came from outside. She was sitting in a chair on the porch, stroking her huge belly. Garth fussed nearby, placing pillows under her back. "Nothing," Betty whispered, taking a sip. "It'll all fall into place soon." The hands clutching the glass didn't shake. April had begun with rains. The sky over Burlington was a gray shroud, and it seemed as if the sun would never reappear. A chilly dampness crept into the very bones, forcing residents to hide in their homes. The main street was deserted, with only the occasional car passing by, raising fountains of spray from the puddles. Lauren couldn't go up to the second floor anymore. The last weeks of her pregnancy had been particularly hard on her. Garth had moved her bed into the living room, right under the window, before she left for her flight. "You'll be more comfortable that way," he said, adjusting the pillows. Betty watched his concern in silence, gritting her teeth. Lately, every such gesture resonated in her with a deafening pain. The contractions began in the early morning hours of April 4th. Betty was awakened by Lauren's cry, sharp, frightened, childlike. It was early 6 o'clock. Garth was on the road. His long-haul GPS unit was marking somewhere near the Illinois border. At other times, she would have been glad he was gone, but now, looking at her daughter's face, white with pain, she felt a prick of pity for the first time. "Hold on, honey," Betty coaxed as she helped her daughter dress. Her hands were familiar. So many years in the hospital had taught her how to handle any situation. Lauren's sweat-drenched hair clung to her neck as she helped her into the car. The rain drummed on the roof, muffling her intermittent breathing. In the emergency room of the clinic, she wasn't just the patient's mother, but the head nurse. Her colleagues nodded understandingly as she filled out the paperwork. The crisp, confident movements of an experienced nurse, only her fingers trembled as she drew a dash in the father column. Lauren was taken to the delivery room, her screams echoing in the sterile hallways. The labor was hard. 16 hours of labor. Betty counted every minute as she sat on the hard chair outside the delivery room. In the pocket of her robe was a pre-prepared DNA sample bag. She touched it now and then, as if it were a talisman. Somewhere in the back of her mind there was a crazy hope. What if she was wrong? What if it was all just a bad dream? The young obstetrician periodically came out, reported the situation. Disclosure of 7 centimeters. Contractions are regular. Fetus normal. Betty nodded. Business as usual protocol. Only this was no ordinary patient. This was her daughter who was about to have a baby with her own adoptive father. The baby girl had been born at midnight when the storm had subsided. 7 pounds, 19 inches, a healthy cry. Betty stood at the glass partition of the baby's room, gazing into the tiny face, and with each passing minute her heart clenched tighter. She saw familiar features, too familiar. The same cut of the eyes, the same curve of the eyebrows, no doubt about it. While the labor-weary Lauren slept, Betty acted quickly and methodically. Years of hospital work had taught her stealth. No one noticed the nurse swabbing the newborn. The cotton swab slid gently down the inside of the baby's cheek. The straw from the juice Garth had drunk from before the flight was already waiting in the bag. A comb of Lauren's hair completed the set. All according to instructions, all sterile. The results came back in a week. Betty opened the envelope in the lab after the night shift, when the department was empty and quiet. Her hands didn't shake as she read the report. Everything she'd suspected, everything she'd feared, was now confirmed in dry scientific language and percentages of coincidence. In black and white, the father of the newborn was incest, abuse, betrayal. After waiting for Garth to leave on another trip, he was now trying to take shorter routes so he could be home more often. She headed for the garage. Lauren was there, as usual lately. She was rocking the baby in an old chair they'd set up next to the workbench. Garth's tools gleamed on the wall in the light of the single bulb, the jack under the pickup waiting for his return. He was going to change the oil. A mundane picture, if it weren't for the heaviness of the test results in Betty's pocket. "I know all about it," she said as she entered. In the silence of the garage, her voice sounded unexpectedly loud. Lauren froze, instinctively clutching the baby to her chest. The frightened eyes in her pale face seemed huge. "I know who the father is." "Mom, please." There was a pleading tone in the daughter's voice. "No, I'm going to the police tomorrow with the test results, with all the evidence. You'll both be held accountable for this." "You don't understand. We love each other." Lauren jumped up, cradling the crying baby girl in her arms. "Love? He's your father." "That's not true. He's nobody to me. I'm just an adopted—" Her voice trailed off into a scream. "He raised you for 5 years, and now—" Betty choked with anger. Images of the past flashed before her eyes. Of Garth teaching Lauren to ride her bike, of Garth braiding her pigtails in the morning, of Garth checking her homework. When had this fatherly love turned into something twisted? "You're just jealous," Lauren hissed, and there was such an adult, angry confidence in her voice. "He hasn't loved you in a long time, and I—" What happened next blended into one endless moment. Betty took a step toward the door needed to get away, to calm down, to think. The thud of heels on the concrete floor echoed in her ears. The edge of her eye caught the movement. Lauren put the baby in the chair and reached for the workbench. The heavy wrench in her hand gleamed dimly in the light of the blow lamp. Sudden darkness. The last thing Betty heard through the creeping fog was the desperate cry of a child and the labored creak of the lowering jack. Somewhere on the edge of consciousness flashed a thought. How strange that at that moment she was worried not about herself, but about her granddaughter. Who would tell the girl the truth now? And then there was silence. Betty Dawson's body was discovered by Marge Simpson in the early morning. At this time of year, the sun was barely above the horizon, coloring the sky a pale pink. The old teacher, as usual, had gone out to water her tulips. The spring flowers had just begun to bloom, delighting the eye with their bright buds. Her morning ritual was interrupted when she noticed something unusual. The garage door of the Dawson house was wide open. It seemed odd at this early hour. At first, Marge thought maybe Garth had returned from a trip, but his truck was nowhere to be seen. She moved closer, holding the watering can. The morning fog was still on the ground, and in its milky haze the garage seemed a dark maw. And then she saw it. Her legs in white uniform pants sticking out from under the pickup truck, the same ones Betty always wore to work at the clinic. Detective Reed Tucker arrived 20 minutes after the 911 call. He had 15 years of small-town police work under his belt, but every call like this still threw him off balance. He knew Betty, everyone knew each other in their Burlington neighborhood. He'd seen her at church on Sundays, said hello at the supermarket, been treated a couple times at the clinic where she worked. By the time he arrived, the scene had already been cordoned off with yellow tape, and the body covered with a tarp. Neighbors, awakened by the sirens of police cars, gathered outside the fence. Quiet conversations, startled looks, shaking heads. The small town was waking up with a sense of the calamity that had happened. Lauren sat on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket. She cradled her week-old daughter to her chest and repeated monotonously, like a memorized text, to every approaching neighbor. She wanted to check the car. She said she was going to surprise Daddy, and the jack slipped. In the morning light, her face seemed like a wax mask, pale, motionless, only her eyes glittering feverishly. Tucker began by looking around the garage. The first thing that caught his eye was the unnatural posture of the body. He'd seen plenty of jacking accidents over the years, but something didn't add up here. It was as if Betty hadn't gotten under the car herself, but had been dragged. There were faint drag marks on the concrete floor. Someone had tried hard to clean them up, but the oil was embedded in the porous concrete. A crumpled rag with brown stains lay by the workbench. He methodically recorded every detail: the position of the jack, the spilled oil, the tools on the workbench, all very neatly laid out. No mess that happens when a man really digs into a car. And this rag. Why would someone want to wipe down the garage floor in the middle of the night? "Where's your dad?" he asked Lauren, walking back to the porch. She looked up at him with blank eyes. "On a voyage. Left the day before yesterday for Chicago. Here, look." She held out her phone with the company's truck tracking app open. The beacon did indeed show a large truck somewhere on the interstate highway. Garth Dawson returned 6 hours later, turning the truck around as soon as he'd gotten word of the tragedy. He was questioned first, right in the patrol car. A tall man with eyes red from sleep deprivation. He looked crushed with grief. He rubbed his face with his palms every now and then, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. "She was never interested in cars," he repeated. "I don't understand why she got under the pickup truck. You say she wanted to surprise me? Jesus, Betty." His voice trailed off as he said his wife's name. Tucker questioned the neighbors, methodically, house by house. They all said with one voice that the Dawson family had always seemed exemplary, but in recent months, something had subtly changed. Lauren's pregnancy had come as a shock to everyone, a quiet girl, an honors student, about to go to college, and this stubborn refusal to name the father of the child, and also strange behavior of Garth. He began to take fewer long-distance flights, more and more time spent at home. "Betty became some kind of twitchy," said Marge Simpson, nervously fixing gray hair. "Always looking out the window, watching the house, and those conversations in the garage at night. I'd sometimes hear when I went out to water the flowers in the early morning." Criminalists worked with the meticulousness that distinguishes professionals in small towns where every crime is an event. They lifted prints off the jack and tools, photographed every inch of the concrete floor, especially where there were signs of attempts to mop something up. Blood and oil samples were collected. Experts said the oil was indeed leaking. The car needed repair. At the clinic where Betty worked, Tucker spent several hours. Colleagues spoke of her with warmth and bewilderment. "She's been spending a lot of time in the lab lately," the superintendent said, nervously rubbing the chain of her glasses. Said she wanted to learn new techniques, and she often stayed for night shifts. In Betty's desk, the detective found a notebook with some notes, but half the pages had been torn out, neatly, as if someone had methodically destroyed the evidence. Only a blurry print remained on the last page. "Test confirmed." God, how could this be? Tucker stared at those half-erased words for a long time, trying to make sense of them. Lauren held herself remarkably collected for someone who'd just lost her mother. Feeding the baby girl, accepting condolences from neighbors, preparing meals. Only her eyes remained dry and empty, as if all the tears in them had burned out before the tragedy. "She was very worried about my pregnancy," she told the detective, rocking her daughter. "Thought I'd ruined my life, and I just want to raise my daughter. Daddy will help." Tucker noticed how her voice trembled at the last words, the way her fingers tensed when she mentioned her father. Something was wrong in this house, in this family. Some secret lurked in the corners of the old garage, in the unspoken words, in the empty eyes of the 17-year-old mother. But there was no proof. GPS confirmed Garth's alibi. His truck had been on the highway all night. Gas station cameras recorded his route, and Lauren's testimony made sense. A grief-stricken woman who decided to do something unusual for her husband. A week after the funeral, Tucker sat in his office, looking at the crime scene photos for the 100th time. It was starting to rain outside the window, the first spring downpour drumming on the eaves. Something was escaping his attention. Something important lurked in those pictures, in the witness statements, in the strange behavior of the Dawson family. But what was it? "Detective Tucker? You have a visitor from the clinic." The receptionist peered into the office. A young woman in a white coat perched on the edge of a chair, holding out an envelope with the logo of a private laboratory called DNA Test. "We found this in Betty's locker. An empty envelope from some test. Could be important?" Tucker twirled the envelope in his hands. It made sense. A mother was trying to find out who the father of her underage daughter's child was. A natural desire. It was just a shame there were no results. The lab probably only kept anonymized data. But there was something else about this case, something wrong. He spread the photos from the garage on the table again. Betty's body had been found under the pickup truck. Allegedly, the jack had slipped when she'd decided to surprise her husband and change the oil herself. "Senior Examiner Morrison? Come see me." Tucker picked up the phone. 5 minutes later, a heavy-set man with glasses was studying the crime scene photos. "Look," Tucker pointed to dark stains on the concrete floor. "The car was really leaking oil. That's why it was on jacks. But these marks, they're kind of wrong." Morrison leaned over the pictures. "Yeah, I see it. Looks like drag marks. And also, see these lighter-colored areas? Someone tried to mop the floor." The garage was re-examined the next day. Forensics worked methodically, illuminated the floor with ultraviolet light, took samples from every square foot, illuminated the walls, examined all the tools. "Detective!" the young examiner called out to him. "Look here!" The concrete, treated with a special compound, showed clear footprints. Someone dragged a heavy object. See those parallel lines in the oil? And here. He pointed to a chain of prints. A woman's shoe, small size, unusual tread pattern. Tucker squatted down. In the light of the portable lamps, The zigzag marks were clearly visible. "Take precise measurements and a full description of the tread," he ordered. The version of the accident crumbled before his eyes. If Betty had gone under the car herself, there would be no drag marks. And why mop the floor if there had been an accident? The search warrant for the Dawson house was signed by late afternoon. Lauren was just putting the baby down when the police started their search. She stood in the nursery doorway, cradling her daughter against her chest, and watched the search in silence. The garage was searched particularly thoroughly. Every box, every toolbox, every corner. "Sir!" one of the officers called out. A pair of white sneakers was found behind a stack of old tires. "Are these your shoes, Miss Dawson?" Tucker asked. Lauren flinched slightly, but remained silent. The sneakers were bagged and sent to the lab. The results came back in 24 hours. Traces of blood and machine oil, the tread an exact match to the prints in the garage. Tucker walked slowly up the porch steps. Lauren opened the door before he knocked. "You found the sneakers." It sounded like a statement, not a question. "We found a lot more than that," he replied. "Drag marks on the floor. Blood on your shoes. You do realize what this means, don't you?" She nodded. Called a neighbor to pick up the baby. Calmly packed a bag with the baby's belongings and papers. "I have no regrets," she said already in the car. She would have ruined everything anyway. She had that test. She would have told everyone, and I couldn't lose him. I couldn't lose our love. In the interview room, she spoke clearly and calmly about how her mother came to the garage with threats, how she grabbed a heavy wrench, the first thing that came to hand, dragging the lifeless body under the car, trying to get it into a natural position. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked suddenly. "When I was lowering the jack, all I could think about in that moment was how to protect him. Not myself, him. So that no one would ever find out. So he could see our daughter. To love her. Because it's so rare for a father to truly love his child." Tucker stared through the glass of the interrogation room at this 17-year-old girl, already a mother, already a killer, and thought about how easily love turns into obsession, how thin the line between defense and crime. There was a baby crying in the hallway. Social services were taking the little girl to an orphanage. Somewhere on the road was Garth Dawson. He would be intercepted at the nearest gas station, but that was another case, another charge. And on the desk in Tucker's office was an empty envelope from the DNA lab. Betty never had time to tell the truth. But sometimes, the detective thought, it's not the test results that give away the worst secrets, but footprints on the concrete floor and a pair of hidden sneakers. Rain drummed on the roof of the property, washing away the traces of another family tragedy. Another story that started with love and ended in the interrogation room.